Russia's naval access is being further constricted as the Baltic Sea becomes a strategic choke point. The escalating maritime isolation of Russia following recent events in the Baltic is explored in this video. Imagine a superpower slowly losing its grip on the seas. For Russia, that nightmare is becoming a reality, especially in the Baltic. What if a series of seemingly isolated events are actually tightening a noose around their naval power, transforming the Baltic into a strategic choke point that could redefine European security? Stick around to uncover the escalating maritime isolation that's leaving Russia vulnerable. It all started quietly, almost like a slow tide pulling back from the shore. One by one, the Baltic nations, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, began cutting ties with Moscow after the invasion of Ukraine. What used to be friendly or at least tolerant neighbors turned into border watchers, tightening control and banning Russian ships from their ports. The sea lanes that once felt open now look like a maritime maze, and Russia is running out of exits. Now, picture this. St. Petersburg, Russia's grand window to the west, surrounded by NATO nations. Every neighboring coastline is part of an alliance that sees Moscow not as a partner, but as a threat. Finland and Sweden, once neutral, are now officially under NATO's umbrella. That changes everything. Suddenly, the Baltic isn't just a sea, it's a strategic trap, a blue battlefield where every ship's movement can be watched, tracked, or stopped. For Russia, this isolation doesn't just sting politically, it's economic quicksand. Over half of its trade once passed through Baltic ports. Now, with sanctions tightening and routes closing, cargo is being rerouted through longer, more expensive paths like the Arctic or the Caspian. That means higher costs, slower delivery, and a serious hit to industries that once relied on fast access to European markets. And while Russia scrambles to adapt, its neighbors are doubling down on defense. NATO fleets now regularly patrol the region. Advanced radar systems line the coasts. Even small nations like Lithuania are investing in anti-ship weapons and coastal defenses, turning what used to be open water into a heavily guarded moat. But here's where it gets even more interesting. This isolation is pushing Russia to look elsewhere, to the east. It's deepening its ties with China, Iran, and countries willing to defy Western sanctions. Yet, the farther Russia looks, the clearer it becomes. No route can truly replace the Baltic. It was more than just water. It was Russia's handshake with the West, and that handshake has been firmly withdrawn. So now, with those doors slamming shut, Russia is trying to build new ones, but every attempt seems to echo back with the same problem: distance. Shifting trade eastward toward Asia sounds good on paper, but in reality, it's a logistical nightmare. The railways through Siberia can't handle the same volume as sea routes, and ports on the Pacific coast, like Vladivostok, are already stretched thin. What was once a straightforward trip across the Baltic to Europe now feels like a detour halfway around the planet. Meanwhile, the Baltic states aren't just celebrating their new geopolitical power, they're using it. Lithuania, for example, has taken the lead in pressuring the EU to tighten sanctions and block any loopholes Russia might use through neighboring ports. Latvia and Estonia have transformed their ports into hubs for Western militaries and energy supplies, ensuring that the region stays firmly under NATO's watchful eye. Each move adds another layer of pressure, another domino falling against Moscow's reach. At the same time, Russia's navy, once proud and formidable in the region, now finds itself boxed in. The Baltic Fleet, stationed in Kaliningrad, is practically surrounded. Every move it makes is tracked by drones, satellites, or Western submarines lurking below the surface. For a fleet that once roamed freely, it's now like being locked inside a fishbowl, visible, vulnerable, and limited. And this maritime squeeze is starting to ripple back home. Russian industries that depended on quick sea exports, from oil and gas to fertilizers and timber, are feeling the pinch. Ships sit idle longer, insurance costs are soaring, and European buyers are finding new suppliers. What used to be a steady flow of money into Russian coffers is now more like a slow drip. Even inside Russia, economists are warning that the loss of Baltic access is more than symbolic. It's a structural blow that could reshape the country's trade map for decades. Still, the Kremlin isn't admitting defeat. Instead, it's painting this isolation as a pivot opportunity, talking about self-reliance and new trade corridors. But beneath the slogans, the reality is stark. Without access to the Baltic, Russia's connection to Europe has all but vanished. The once busy waters that carried Russian oil, coal, and influence are now guarded by nations united in keeping Moscow at bay. And as NATO's presence expands, every wave in the Baltic tells the same story: that Russia's maritime world, once wide and open, is shrinking into something smaller, tighter, and far more dangerous for those still trying to navigate it. So here's the big question everyone's wondering. Why is the Baltic Sea such a big deal for Russia? Think of the Baltic like a front door, Russia's easiest way to step into Europe. For decades, it was how Russian oil, gas, timber, and steel reached the rest of the world. Every ship sailing from St. Petersburg or Kaliningrad carried more than cargo. It carried political weight. But that door is now slowly being bolted shut. With every new NATO flag raised and every sanction tightened, Russia's maritime world in the Baltic is shrinking. Not in one big crash, but in a steady, quiet squeeze. And it's not just about losing access, it's about losing advantage. The Baltic used to give Russia quick, cheap routes to Europe. Now, every voyage is more expensive, more watched, and more restricted. The numbers tell the story. Oil exports from Baltic ports have fallen month after month since mid-2024, forcing Moscow to reroute ships through the Arctic and the Black Sea. Those new paths are longer, costlier, and riskier, especially when you factor in ice, insurance, and the constant threat of more sanctions. But here's a twist worth asking about. Can Russia simply move its trade elsewhere and ignore the Baltic? Not really. The alternatives look better on paper than in practice. The Arctic route through the Northern Sea might sound bold and futuristic, but it's treacherous. Thick ice, unpredictable weather, and limited infrastructure make it unreliable year-round. The Pacific ports, like Vladivostok, are already overloaded and far from the European buyers who used to take in most of Russia's exports. So, while Moscow tries to spin this shift as a pivot east, the reality is that the Baltic still carries an importance no other route can replace. Meanwhile, the Baltic nations aren't just watching, they're acting. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia have turned their coastlines into watchtowers. They've tightened port controls, banned Russian ships, and invited NATO patrols to make sure the sea stays secure. Even Sweden and Finland, once neutral, are now part of the alliance, surrounding the Baltic fleet and cutting off the last bits of maritime breathing space Russia had left. What was once open water is now a well-guarded moat. And that brings us to another question. What's happening to Russia's navy in all this? It's boxed in. The Baltic fleet, once proud and dominant, is now mostly stuck in Kaliningrad, surrounded by NATO territory. Every move it makes is tracked by satellites, drones, or submarines. What used to be a power projection zone is now more like a fish tank, visible from all sides, with very little room to maneuver. The same ships that once patrolled confidently now have to plan every voyage like a chess move, anticipating NATO's next counter. This maritime squeeze is starting to ripple through Russia's economy. Companies that relied on Baltic ports to move oil, gas, fertilizers, and metals are facing rising costs and fewer buyers. Ships are sitting idle longer, freight insurance is climbing, and some goods that used to reach Europe in days now take weeks to get there. Economists inside Russia are quietly warning that this isn't just a short-term problem. It's a deep structural shift that could reshape the country's trade map for years to come. But of course, Moscow doesn't want to show weakness. Instead, it calls this a turning point, promising to become more self-reliant and to build new trade corridors through the Arctic, Asia, and even Africa. Yet the truth is simple. The Baltic wasn't just one of many options. It was the main gateway to the West. And as that gateway closes, Russia is learning how hard it is to find another one that fits the same key. So the next question becomes, what happens when a superpower finds itself cut off from the sea it once dominated? Wait a second. If you are new to this channel and you like what you see and hear, please subscribe, like, and join the conversation below. If you're not convinced yet, subscribe, and tell us how we can earn that click. We're all about getting better together. When a superpower loses access to the sea that once defined its strength, everything starts to shift. Not just trade, but identity, strategy, and even pride. For Russia, the Baltic was never only about shipping routes. It was about presence, the ability to say, "We belong here." Losing that access chips away at something deeper, the sense of being a major European power. So what happens now? Russia is forced to play defense in a region where it once set the tone. Its warships can't sail freely, its exports are monitored, and its neighbors, small but united, now hold the upper hand. It's a strange twist of history. Just a decade ago, Baltic countries worried about Russia's influence. Today, Russia worries about theirs. NATO's steady expansion has turned the sea into a lake bordered by members of one alliance, with Russia standing isolated on the shore. And that raises another question. How does this change Russia's global strategy? Well, it's already happening. Cut off from easy European routes, Moscow is looking east, doubling down on trade with China, India, and the Middle East. It's expanding Arctic ports, building pipelines toward Asia, and investing in the Northern Sea route as a backup lifeline. But while these efforts make headlines, they're still small compared to what's been lost. The Arctic is frozen for much of the year. Its infrastructure can't yet match the Baltic's efficiency, and the distances to key markets are far longer. It's like replacing a 6-lane highway with a narrow, icy backroad. And yet, here's the irony. This isolation in the Baltic may actually be pushing Russia to reinvent its maritime strategy entirely. By necessity, it's learning to operate under pressure, finding new allies, new trade routes, and new narratives to tell its people. The government calls it strategic independence. But beneath that slogan lies a quieter truth, adaptation born out of limitation. Still, as Moscow looks eastward, the Baltic continues to haunt its westward dreams. The once busy ports of Primorsk and Ust-Luga still hum with reduced activity, their docks no longer the bustling crossroads of east and west they once were. Instead, they've become symbols, reminders of how fast the tide can turn in geopolitics. So the next question we have to ask is this: if the Baltic has become a NATO-controlled sea and Russia's access keeps shrinking, what does that mean for the balance of power in Europe itself? It means Europe is quietly entering a new maritime era, one where the balance of power isn't decided by who has the biggest navy, but by who controls the access points. The Baltic Sea, once a shared space of trade and tension, is now a stage for containment. Every port, patrol, and policy move around it tells the same story. Russia's circle is tightening, while NATO's reach grows stronger and more coordinated. But history has a way of surprising everyone. Russia may be cornered today, yet it's not without options or ambition. The same nation that once turned setbacks into strategy could be plotting its next move: a diplomatic breakthrough, a new trade route, or a pressure point far from the Baltic itself. The question now isn't just how Russia copes with isolation, but how long Europe can maintain it before something shifts again. Because in the Baltic, nothing stays still for long. Not the tides, not the ships, and certainly not the balance of power. The next wave is already forming. The only mystery is where it will crash first. Thanks for making it this far. It means you like what we do here at Eurobulletin. We will appreciate if you took 5 seconds to like, subscribe, and leave a comment on your views regarding the topic. See you tomorrow for another video.